I am hoping that today's presentation will be somewhat brief and somewhat to the point in terms of helping you understand and arrive at a decent decision when it comes to choosing your path for native mobile automation, stuff like that. So hopefully you will ask questions if you'd like, and I'll leave a little bit of time at the end as well, because the data points I had to go over are rather simple, but hopefully we'll be straight to the point and help you make a decision. So what we're going to talk about today is a little bit about types of mobile apps, although if you attended Wim's presentation, I think you probably got quite a bit of information about the types of mobile apps. In fact, he probably covered it more comprehensively than I will, no doubt. We'll talk about Appium, its origins, its architecture, and how it operates at a fundamental level. And then we'll talk about the same thing for native frameworks. After that, we'll talk about the pros and cons, why you should or should not do one. There is no good, right, single answer. There's a series of decisions to make based on the situation that you're in. And I've tried to lay things out in a way that's pretty clear and easy to understand. Also send you some resources. In fact, the slide deck is actually 2 or 3 times longer than what I'm presenting today, simply because of the constraints of time, as well as the fact that I think a lot of it would duplicate what Wim has already presented. And 80% of the slides in this deck were produced by Wim anyway, so I'm essentially reusing a lot of his content. Always gracious, always very thankful to have Wim on the team, producing all this amazing content and being one of the world experts on mobile testing. So who am I? I'm Marcus Merrell, Senior Director of Technology Strategy at Sauce Labs. What that means, that's kind of a new title, at least it is to me. What it means is that I'm working to build a philosophy or a vision, or trying to help the CTO and the CPO, the head of product, put a vision together for what Sauce Labs will be in the future. Now, why do I get to do this? Is because I've been involved with the Selenium project for about 13 years. I started using Selenium literally the day it was debuted at the Google Test Automation Conference in 2008. I saw a demo of it, worked up a prototype with a colleague of mine, and within 24 hours, we made the decision to overturn a 3-year quick test professional product, and throw it out entirely and restart everything. And within 6 weeks, we had achieved parity with what we had spent 3 years on with quick test professional, simply because of the power of being able to use Java, as well as the power of scalability of using an open source solution. So I've been using Selenium for 13 years, and along the way started to take some responsibility on the project itself, because I'm not the most technical person in the world. I'm pretty good, but I leave the super coding to people like Wim, who can contribute to open source in a meaningful way. What I like to do is settle contract disputes and deal with legal and help organize conferences and events and make sure that the speaker core is diverse and those kinds of things. And since people seldom want to do things like that, I've ended up in the role and kept it quite rigorously. Now, the interesting thing about I think the interesting thing about my career path, looking back on everything, is that I've been in test for 20 years. And I've been in UI testing for 15 of those 20 years, but at heart, I'm still an API tester. I'm still someone who really likes to connect deep, closely with the contract, with the ones and zeros of what the software is meaning to be doing. And so I'm always trying to take this kind of insight and back-end server validation and try to apply it to how people work on user interface testing and DOM to database testing. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. I'm trying to make sure that testing is done right at the right layer at the right time for the best performance and the most amount of confidence that you can have throughout your software development lifecycle. That's a little bit my obsession, and it's a little bit strange. I think that a company that was sort of founded by the inventor of Selenium hired me, who always discourages people from using Selenium everywhere. It's not that I'm trying to discourage people from using Selenium and Appium. It's that I'm trying to encourage Selenium and Appium to be used at the right layer at the right time, which sometimes means not as much as people currently are. So I'm very glad that I work at Sauce Labs now and can spread the word about how to do these things the most efficient way to create the most confidence in your product. So my life is otherwise consumed by family, music, and robots. I like building robots. That lamp there is a Warp Core replica that I built using 3D printing and Arduino to tell the weather. So It's a Star Trek warp core that tells the weather. We're also obsessed with Disneyland, and I like to play the piano. That's a little bit about me. So let's talk a little bit about the types of mobile apps that exist in the world. I'm going to keep this fairly brief, like I said, because I believe Wim covered it. But so the first type of app is the most obvious. It's the native application, meaning that it was written using native calls to the device itself. It's not actually a web page. It's not a web application. It's a native app written natively and deployed through an app store or app center, like you would see, in any sort of game, something like that. That's what we would call a native app. Like I said, I'm not going to go into super detail because I think this is already pretty well understood. Or you can launch Safari or Chrome and go to a website and you'll see these kinds of apps. Alternatively, you can do a hybrid or a progressive web app that actually embeds web pages within a native app framework to give you kind of a portal into the web pages themselves. And these are just the kinds of ways you can approach app development, which most companies, I think, are still working their way through what the best way, the right way to do things is. So let's go straight to how we test these things and the difference between Appium and native frameworks. So Appium is a synchronous testing tool developed in the open source, similarly to how Selenium was developed. In fact, it was actually co-invented by the same person who invented Selenium, Jason Huggins, who was also a co-founder of Sauce Labs. Appium is an attempt to unify the way you test an application so that you can use any language, Java, JavaScript, Python, Ruby. You can use any language that you would normally use for Selenium or for any kind of application development. And when it gets down to the device itself and being able to operate on an application or an app, it will operate the same way between Android and iOS. It'll operate the same way, irrespective of the operating system that you're running. It was an attempt to unify the construction of these kinds of tests so that in theory, the same team could execute the same kinds of tests on both applications with very, very little code change. I'll talk about the fact that that was the promise and the reality has been a little bit different in most cases. But at the moment, it's enough to just say that that was the original intent behind this project's existence. The funny thing about it is that Appium was first proposed literally as a 5-minute lightning talk by Dan Cuellar in the 2012 Selenium conference in Boston. It was a 5-minute talk where he said, wouldn't it be great if we could combine the iOS and Android testing into one thing using the similar protocols that we use for WebDriver? And here, what the heck, it's called Appium. After that talk, Jason Huggins and Dan Cuellar got into contact and started working together, started collaborating, and within just a few weeks, they had a prototype ready to go. And here we are 9 years later, and this project is backed by the JS Foundation, and it's a fully fledged open source testing application medium used by millions and millions of people. And my point in saying that is, as a conference organizer, I'm always trying to encourage people to submit lightning talks, because lightning talks can become, a 5-minute talk can become a real thing. I've seen lightning talks become companies. Lightning talks have become larger talks. Lightning talks have, in the case of Dan Cuellar, helped launch or relaunch careers. So speaking out when you see an opportunity, people will clamor for attention to help you to get that thing done if it's a good enough idea. So Appium is an open source tool used for automating native, mobile, web, hybrid. We could also add progressive mobile applications on iOS, Android, Tizen, Mac, Windows desktop platforms. Now here's the ecosystem underneath Appium and all of the disparate parts that need to be put together in order to make Appium work. Because at its core, when you send an Appium command over the wire, it gets translated into a native command on the device itself. So if you are writing an Espresso test and you say click on something, and then you write a similar Appium script that says click on something, it's going through, eventually the end result is the same exact action. But in Appium's case, it has to be translated through all these different layers to make sure that it's being translated into the correct command for the correct device given the context. But the good news is that all you have to do is switch the device you're talking to, and Appium will understand I'm no longer translating into Android. I am now translating into iOS. There's just you can think of this as a decision tree. It's actually a collection of libraries that are meticulously maintained by the Appium team. But this is a decision tree that your code goes through in order to find the right destination. And it works remarkably well. But let's illustrate the path of a single command. So when you issue a single command like open URL or click on element or something like that, if you're trying to even find an element just to examine it, or give me the attribute for this single element, what is the text on the page at this point right here? Every single command you do goes through the following steps. The test script makes a library call on your machine to the Appium client that is also on your machine locally. That is then translated into W3C compliant WebDriver call to the Appium server, which may be on your machine, but if you're using a service like Sauce Labs, is not on your machine. It's somewhere else. It's remote. It could be remote 10 feet away. It could be remote 10,000 miles away. After that, it's translated. This command is translated into the XCUITest driver, assuming we're on iOS. And then the command is translated into a JSON Web Protocol call to the WebDriver agent, which is then translated into an XCUITest command itself, which is Apple proprietary, at which point it is actually contacting the device and saying, we're going to perform this action. And then the result of that single command gets returned back through all these steps and gets up translated all the way back through. Now, Yair and Wim might be going a little bit crazy because I'm greatly oversimplifying this. Truth is, it's a lot more complicated underneath, but this is the 10-second version of what every single command you're sending through Appium has to go through in order to do a single thing on a device. This is for every test you've ever executed with Appium. Now, when you run on Sauce Labs, that dotted line represents the jump between your machine, or the machine executing the test, controlling the test, and the Sauce Labs cloud. What I call that is the 3,000-mile round trip. So at some point, if I'm in Austin, Texas, and I'm talking to the San Jose data center, when I send an Appium command, there's a 3,000-mile network hop between me and the device itself. And then all these things happen on other machines before they get translated to the device itself, and then the thing goes back. The point is, it's slow, and every point along the hop adds opportunity for instability as well as conflict. If the Appium drivers haven't been kept up to date, if you're working on cutting edge and Appium hasn't kept up with it, that kind of thing. It's a rare problem for that to happen, but it is possible. It introduces risk. So let's contrast that with the native app platform, XCUITest and Espresso. XCUITest for iOS, Espresso for Android. The important thing to understand about this is that when you execute a native app test on iOS or Android, the entire test is executed and controlled from within the device itself. So you have a build agent, that's your machine. Say you're running it on your local, or a build machine is running it on something like GitHub, GitLab, GitHub Actions, that kind of thing. You're going to basically tarball the entire compiled set of code that you're going to execute, upload it to Sauce Labs in this case. You're going to specify the tunnel, the devices that you'd like to test on, the tests you would like to run. You're going to upload all of that as a package to Sauce, and then 100% of the activity on Sauce Labs takes place on the device itself, outside of a few API calls to report logs and screenshots and stuff like that. But the entire action takes place on the device itself. The only external calls there being to your application backend servers, wherever they are located. But you're cutting out monstrous amounts of network latency and instability and risk factor and moving parts in order to execute a native app. It's probably starting to sound like I'm biased in favor of native apps. The truth is, I do find them nice, but as we'll get to here in a few minutes, there are profound reasons to stick with Appium in certain circumstances. My point here is just to illustrate the difference in execution model, if that does end up being a factor for you in your choice. So the test results are then sent back to your build agent, and also stored on the Sauce Labs cloud. And then you have a result. So this is a little bit a case of you can fire and forget. You can send these tests off and you can wait. You can wait for the results to be reported back. It is currently, I mean, the client by default is a blocking call, but you don't actually have to make it a blocking call. You can send a command asynchronously and just say, I'm going to wait for these tests to be complete. Use the API to find out when it has actually completed its run. So after having explained the core, what I view as the core difference between Appium and native and how they execute, let's talk about reasons why you would use Appium or native app, and we'll talk about pros and cons of each one. So with Appium, literally, like, I mean, any language that Appium has created bindings for, you can use in order to create tests. And that is profound because there are a lot of teams that are still separated from the development teams, and the developers are all using Xcode or I can't believe I can't think of the name of the Swift, Xcode or Swift. And you may not want to use Xcode or Swift. You might have a team full of testers who are educated in JavaScript or Java or some other language, and you want them to be able to test this application. You can use whatever language you want, and it will work with Appium. With native frameworks, iOS and Android, you're married pretty much to Java or Kotlin for Android or Objective-C and Swift for iOS. See, if I just clicked ahead, I would have seen the name of the language. Can't believe I blanked on it. Another risk factor for Appium is that it trails iOS and Xcode for Android and UI automator changes. Now, this used to be a much bigger problem than it is right now. At this point, it's a pretty automatic thing that when Apple or Android produces new versions, it gets adopted within the Appium ecosystem. It's not instantly, but it's soon. It's possible that Wim or Yair would have a better insight into this, but I know that the risk of the trailing nature of Appium, I know that the risk of that is fairly low compared to what it used to be, but it's still a factor. Whereas native frameworks, as soon as they release a new version, it's already up to date. It is necessarily up to date. Kind of by definition, it's up to date. So if they ever change the contractor or the ways you send commands over, Appium still has to catch up, especially if it's a major change. Whereas the native framework, once it comes to you, it's already there. So to me, the big thing about Appium is at the end of all of these advantages that you can look at for Appium, can you stomach the 3,000-mile round trip on every single command? Or do you really need all the commands to be executed on the device itself so that they can run without this constant translation between network and JSON to binary and all of that? And the other problem is that we have a lot of issues with companies, not necessarily companies. There are companies as well as open source projects who have created frameworks that wrap up Appium, who don't necessarily optimize the commands. They work beautifully on local executions, but when you actually get into a cloud solution like Sauce Labs, you find that it will make 35 calls to find an element before it actually finds it because it does a very inefficient search. It'll query and say, are you it? No. Are you it? No. Are you it? No. As opposed to using a very targeted kind of XPath or something like that. So if you're using a third-party framework that controls or wraps up Appium, there's a decent chance that it wasn't optimized for cloud-based execution and that it's sending far, far, far more commands to the cloud than it should in order to accomplish its task. It also is possible they have no choice because it's backed by some sort of AI, machine learning, something like that, and there's no way for them to optimize for that. But either way, it adds slowness that you tend to, that what I find is people tend to think that it's on the Sauce Labs platform. It's truly on the framework itself that's wrapping up Appium and making it less efficient. So that's just one factor you should probably also consider. Now, for native frameworks, since there isn't that layer, that 3,000-mile round trip, if a test is very, very, very inefficient, it's still executing on the same iron that it's testing. So performance is pretty much the same. It can work very, very quickly no matter what's going on inside the test. So, in my opinion, here, these are my opinions, but these are pretty well backed up, and I would love to. I don't think we have time for any sort of panel discussion, but it would be interesting to see if Yair and Wim are in agreement about these points. You should use Appium if your test uses a different tech stack from the app development team. So that's like I mentioned earlier. If your app development team is using Objective-C and Swift, and you have a QA stack of Java or JavaScript, probably doesn't make sense to teach everyone Swift and make them go down that road, especially if the same group of people will be testing both the iOS and the Android app. You would then have to make them learn Swift and Kotlin in order to keep those tests up to date. That is very impractical. This way, if there is the promise that the iOS and Android applications or apps are similar to each other, then it makes a lot more sense to have them develop one set of tests that will run between each. I don't necessarily consider that a best practice because it's very, very rare that the apps are similar enough to actually run from the same code base. But if you have the same team generating those two test bases, then they at least understand what's going on and they can account for the differences in a way that's mindful and intelligent, as opposed to the teams just being completely siloed out. If you can tolerate the risk of Xcode and Android changes and not mind that once in a great while, the Appium stack will have trouble because it's not kept up to date, it really isn't that common, like I said, but that is a risk factor. It is a small risk factor that should be considered. If you already have a huge project containing a lot of Appium tests that are running and giving you value, you shouldn't migrate, in my opinion. You should keep them where they are. And because there is no migrating the tests, there's pretty much only rewriting from the ground up. With some, exceptions, if you're using an intelligent page object model, you can translate the page object model over to the native app, but then you'd have to do it twice, once for iOS, once for Android. In my opinion, if you have this already, stick with it. There's probably not a compelling reason to change unless it's like major team overhaul, reorg, something like that. I missed one. Oh yeah, if you prefer or require black box testing, closed box testing, then Appium is your choice. Native frameworks give you the ability to introspect on the app and ask questions that Appium likely will have difficulty asking. Partly because Appium wasn't designed to be white box, and partly because Appium, partly because you just don't have the options available to you, because Appium tries very hard to be agnostic to iOS and Android, and only introduces a few changes where you can say explicitly, this is an iOS thing, this is an Android thing. There are several, but it's just they don't offer everything. You should use native frameworks if you're an app developer and you don't want to learn a new tool. If you are the person developing the app, absolutely. You should just, you're probably not developing both the iOS and the Android app. And even if you are, you're already in that language, in that context. And if you're in that state, or you want developers to be able to read, write, maintain the tests, and that's a requirement, then you should probably use native frameworks. If you want to keep your test code in the same language repo tool as the app under test, you should probably use native frameworks. Shift left is also good for native frameworks because it implies that developers are the ones doing this stuff. And also, if you need more control, fine control over the device itself, over the internals of the device, you should probably stick to native frameworks. Also, all that stuff about execution time that I mentioned already is a big factor in choosing native over Appium, especially if the distance between you and the remote data centers would introduce latency or consistency. Now, that said, as Sauce Labs moves into the public cloud and is able to offer data centers in dozens of locations throughout the world, this is going to become less of an issue overall, but it is worth considering right now if you're at a decision point. And that's pretty much it. I have 4 minutes left for Q&A if we'd like, and want to see if we have any live questions.
I do have a couple of questions here, Marcus. We'll see how many we can get to. I'm going to start with one that came in from Alejandro asking, would you suggest following a hybrid automation approach? In other words, using both Appium and native frameworks for CI/CD purposes. uses the example here, having a set of test cases implemented in native frameworks and some others in Appium. The use case being tests in Appium for iOS are usually slow. So what would your recommendations be around a hybrid automation approach, CI/CD purposes?
My short answer is yes. I think that that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. I just, my only caveat there would be cultural, not technical, which is I think that everyone needs to go into it mindfully, knowing that there are two code bases that are at risk for overlap, and that people really need to make sure they have an understanding and that they bought into this concept that okay, we're going to split these things. We're going to keep really good, solid inventory of what's being covered here, what's being covered here, and when to make the choice of put something here versus put something here. And also try to make those choices in a way that is durable over the life of organizational changes, which is probably the biggest risk to nearly any test automation effort. But I think that it's a fine approach because as you say, if Appium for iOS are really, really slow and you want to write a few native app tests to cover that, absolutely you should do so.
Another question here from John. I think we got an answer in writing as well, but I think we have some new information that's close to your work, Marcus. So I thought I would toss this one your way as well. John is asking, can Appium integrate with accessibility testing tools, for example, Axe?
Wim has answered this. This is currently not. I don't have a better answer than that, except that Sauce Labs is actively working with a company named DQ on the Axe plugin and the ability to test their apps with mobile. We have already started a beta for doing accessibility testing on the web, and we're hoping very much that we will be able to offer mobile app accessibility testing, as well as we are hoping that Appium, as Wim said, adds a direct accessibility testing support in 2.0.
Question on native framework testing from Marcin asking, how does native framework testing work when I have a set of apps that work in unison, or would Appium be better for that case?
I think Appium would be better in that case because of the synchronous nature of Appium tests. So when you send a command to device A, you've sent it. You can then send a command to device B, and you've sent it, and what the results of everything are. If a native app is intended to be run kind of on its own, at its own pace, and it's very difficult to try to synchronize those two things. I can see how it would be possible using a queuing system, but that sounds like crazy engineering. And I think it would be better to just use Appium for its synchronous nature.